and welcome to our first winter outlook of the 23-24 season here at WeatherWorks. This is our first preview, meaning our first thoughts into what we can expect for the pattern as we head through the upcoming winter. I'm meteorologist Mike Mahalik, and with me today is senior meteorologist Ken Elliott. Ken, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Can't believe it's that time of year already, Mike. It's crazy.
I know, right? It seems like we just got out of the winter season. We're, trucking right through summer, and now we're right into winter already, talking about what we can expect.
Yeah, Labor Day is almost here, and that really marks the beginning of the stretch run into winter, so to speak.
Absolutely. So for a quick overview here of what we're going to be talking about today, we're first going to start out with some lean winter climatology. Then we're going to go into the seasonal forecast overview, which is what everybody's looking for. All the patterns, drivers, and things like that will be there for you. And then El Nino placement, because we are finally seeing El Nino after several years of having a La Nina episode in the tropical Pacific. So that's one of the important pattern drivers this year. So we certainly are going to talk about that. But first off, I'm going to start out talking. Actually, it's going to be Ken that's going to start out talking about what can we forecast here in August. What can we see? What can we start to glean as far as the winter's concerned? So, Ken, why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, and it's more big picture kind of things. We're not going to be talking so much about we think late December looks like it's cold, warm, or whatever. We're talking general patterns, and not even general patterns over a 2 or 3 week span. We're talking about patterns, and these could be jet streams, sea surface temperatures, El Nino in a large scale sense over 2, 3, 4 month period, because these certainly change day to day and certainly on a week to week basis. So again, what we think these look like in the overall sense over many, many weeks to the 3 and 4 month time periods of the winter. And once we have these general trends and patterns that we think will happen, we kind of put that into temperature and precipitation outlooks. And here, think more qualitative than quantitative. Does it
Hmm.
look wetter? How much wetter? Well, we're not quite there yet. But if we think certain places look wetter or drier or warmer and cooler, we can kind of start to delineate those areas that we think will lean one way or the other during the winter season with some very early levels of confidence into that. So, you know,
Right.
more details. Yeah, we're still 1 to 2 months away from that. We'll get back to you in October on that sort of thing. But in terms of general ideas, that's where we're at now.
Exactly. The big picture basically is what Ken's talking about that we can see
Exactly. 100%. And one thing I will say is typically, and we say this for winter, but it's really true for any seasonal outlook. Higher confidence is almost always in temperature forecasts. Since we're going to have an El Nino, and you're going to talk a lot more about that in a little bit. Since we're
Sure.
going to have an El Nino this year, we actually have a little bit more confidence in the overall wetter and drier areas than we ordinarily would at an early lead. So we'll see how that kind of plays into it too when we start to debut these maps in a little bit.
Right. So now that you guys have an overview of what we can really talk about in this early period of time in August, one thing we like to start with is climatology. With any seasonal forecast, climatology is very important to where we're going into the future. So we have to look back into the past to see where we're going in the future. So it's no real surprise that a lot of areas in the northeastern quarter of the country saw a little less snowfall over the last year. So we thought, well, hey, why don't we take a look at maybe the 10 least snowy winters out of the last 100 seasons. So it turns out when we do look at that 95% of the time, the next season features an increase. And it's typically around the average snowfall, around the 30-year normal. That's what we typically see in the season following the lean winter. So you can see that in the graphs here. If you can see my cursor here, I mean, looking at Concord, New Hampshire, you're a little bit over the 30-year average, which is the gray bar, is what we typically see following that lean winter. Same thing in Boston, same thing in Harrisburg, Baltimore, Richmond. So we do see it at that 30-year average or even a little bit more as far as snowfall is concerned. and that exceeds about 40% of the time. So, given El Nino coming up, New York City to Richmond likely see the greatest rebound in snowfall amounts for the season. So we're not talking about, the number of events or big time snowstorms or anything like that. We're not talking that aspect, but just overall for the season. If we head to the Midwest, we see a little bit of a softer increase on those snowfall totals. We're still seeing an increase. If you can see here in the green circles, we're still seeing, these snowfall amounts right around the 30-year average, maybe a little shy in some cases, maybe a little over in other cases, but we are seeing that same sort of response, maybe just not as stark a difference. So that's what we're looking at after lean winters and what kind of comes afterwards. So Ken, you're going to pick up a little bit more about where we go from this climatology that we just took
Sure. Yep.
took a look at, and how we get into the forecast from here.
Yeah, climatology is great, but if we were just to forecast climatology, our forecast would not be so good, unless maybe the last couple of years might be the relative exception to that, but you're going to miss
Yeah.
stuff. That's just all there is to it. So we talk about analogs in a lot of our forecasts, and basically we look for analogs, and all an analog is a winter in the past that we think matches up with the one that's coming up fairly well. And
Right.
unfortunately, there's never a perfect one. So you're always making some sacrifices and concessions. And you want to do that too, because there will always be things that happen in any season. Doesn't need to be just winter, by the way, that you don't expect, or that any analog's not going to have. So you want to have a solid number, and there's kind of like this Goldilocks thing. You don't want too few or too many, because if too few, you get too many extremes start working in. Get too many, and then it's like, well, you have 10 winters to 15 winters. That's a lot. Then you average that out, then you kind of get average. So it's kind of like this 6 to 10 number, and different forecasters have different opinions on that. But it also depends on what you have. So, for example, in this year, we're going to probably want an El Nino year, and
Hmm.
preferably an El Nino year after a couple of La Nina years, because we want to be as close to where we're at now as we can get. Now, again, there's other factors, and El Nino is just one of them, probably the relatively more important one, but still, it's not like an El Nino vacuum here. So we get these analogs, and then we kind of like take a look at them and say, okay, what happens here? And we did a set of analogs for this winter preview, outlook number one, but it's not like that's just going to stay static either. We have to continually
Hmm.
evaluate these and say, well, this particular winter looked like a good analog 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago, but now I don't know. The ocean warmth in the Pacific and the El Nino region looks a little bit different, or whatever it might be. We might take a look at that in a slightly different light, and maybe we either discount it, or a lot of meteorologists weight them. So, oh, this one's a very good match, so maybe we'll give that one double or triple influence versus a lesser match. So this is kind of an evolving process. It started probably 2 months ago at some level, and we're certainly only in the middle of that now. And to kind of conceptualize that, we have this coming up right now. We have this beautiful kind of, it shows the cycle. It's almost like a water cycle here. And we start out by observing. That's what you do. Before you can figure out what kind of analogs you have, you got to know where you are. And not necessarily
Hmm.
where exactly you are too. You also want to take a look at some general modeling to see, okay, where do we think El Nino's going? So that just because it's a good match now doesn't mean it will be a good match in 6, 8 weeks from
Hmm.
now, or certainly 3, 4, or 5 months. So after you kind of take a look at that, then you start to look at analogs to see what matches up. And then you evaluate them. That's when you start saying, okay, this one looks good in maybe El Nino sense, but man, we had like a very wet summer in the East. This didn't really happen that year, so maybe it's not so good. So then we start kind of doing a little bit of a balancing act, and that evolves into weighting the analogs. I kind of referenced that a second ago. So you don't want to you don't want to give everything equal weight, because generally something matches better than others most times. And you and I were joking about this yesterday, but I think an important step of the process is stepping back and not getting too engrossed in this. Because if you look at analogs for the winter every day for 3 or 4 months, you will likely outthink yourself, and probably make changes to your forecast you didn't want to make. So, take a week or 10 days away from it, then come back and then start the process again. Because if you do it too
Right.
long, too much, you'll drive yourself nuts.
Yeah, and Ken's exactly right. This is an evolving process. It's not where you take those analog years and you just stick with them all the way out through the upcoming season. It's constantly changing, constantly evolving. We're going through this process. So, just like anything, you have to keep developing a better and better product as you get closer and closer to the season. So, Ken, that's basically what we're having for analogs, but let's compare what we had last season as far as the jet streams are concerned to what we're expecting this season. And I think it's quite stark a difference.
It really is. Yeah, I mean, we have this strong ridge of high pressure southwest of Alaska, leading to
Hmm.
the deep trough over the western United States.
And they had a
That's why
lot
it
of snow
snowed
out there.
exactly. I mean, that's how it happened. That's how you get that.
Yeah.
And more importantly, too, the polar jet stream was pretty dominant last year. Oftentimes, it's the subtropical one that's dominant. Well,
Mm,
last year it was the polar jet stream that was more dominant. So that allowed the stronger storms to be out west, and kind of how many times we see these storms cut up the central part of the United States and go into Canada. So
right.
that's what we had last year, and you can see the trough, and then the other ridge out in eastern Canada. So that's what we had last year, and with those analogs, this is what we came up with for this year as a, again, general pattern. This isn't going to be on any particular day what we're going to see, but we
Hmm.
average it out, and this is kind of what we think the pattern's going to look like this year. Obviously, very different.
Yeah.
That ridge over the Pacific south of Alaska has been replaced with a trough of low pressure. We've got more of a ridge of high pressure across parts of Canada. And
Hmm.
more importantly, not shown here directly, is we think the jet streams will be flipped this year, in that not their locations be flipped, but the
Mm,
subtropical jet stream is much more likely to be active in the dominant one this year. So that portends partially some bigger storms and stuff, which we'll get into in a little bit, but
yeah.
a little bit more cold air to work with at times, a little more active of a jet stream. So almost a complete opposite of what we were last year.
Right, exactly. I mean, the subtropical jet is definitely going to be stronger than last year due to the El Nino forcing for the most part. So that's something really going to bring in more moisture. So here are our precipitation and temperature thoughts. Now, these are our first thoughts, Ken. They're not set in stone right now. These will likely change. But what we're seeing is this is our best um, approximation of what we think for the upcoming season.
Correct. And this is a fairly typical El Nino kind of look,
Yeah.
especially in the southern US. And that's what we would expect. And, I sometimes wish that it would snow in Louisiana sometimes, because it would be an easy winter forecast down there. I mean, our forecasts are likely change in the northern, at least in some aspects of it. But I don't see the Gulf Coast forecast changing all that much. If anything, we might even go a darker shade on some of the precipitation down there in future outlooks. But yeah, this
Right.
is certainly not set in stone. And as we kind of start to look at what some of those kind of big picture trends are, don't worry, these maps will kind of stay side by side as we go on to this, but you'll get
Hmm.
the flavor for the El Nino.
Right, exactly. So let's see what our main takeaways are for this upcoming season. So obviously, like we talked about before, we have those strong and active southern jet stream that focuses a lot of precipitation across the southern US into the mid-Atlantic at times. So that's where things can get a little bit tricky up there.
And that's kind of also why we kind of like the areas from New York City to Richmond to rebound in snow this year. We think that at least a couple
Hmm.
times that's going to get north.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to have that added moisture coming from the subtropical jet stream, and that can lead to possibly some more big storm potential on the East Coast compared to recent seasons. We haven't had these big monster nor'easters recently, right? So this year, with the added moisture, with more jet dynamics, you know, maybe we have a little bit more likely of a chance.
Absolutely.
So across the north, extreme cold is a little bit limited across the north. Not to say, I mean, look, Ken, you know as well as I and a lot of people out there that North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, it's going to be cold no matter what, right? Especially in the heart of winter. But maybe the cold shots are a little less brutal. than what they typically
Exactly.
can see. So that's what we're
Fewer
looking
below
at
zero kind of days and that sort of thing.
here.
It'll be plenty cold at times. Sure, there'll be a couple of warm days, just like in any winter,
Yeah,
but from the long term, this is the kind of thing that they would like to hear from a heating standpoint. It's gonna be a little bit less harsh of a winter. It's cold, but not you know dreadfully cold.
exactly. Yeah, it can still snow, but hey, not quite as cold. But anyway, relative to normal, the South will be coldest, and that's because of more rainfall, more systems, more clouds, things like that. That El Nino typically has an effect on. So out west, we're watching the Southern Rockies, for a little bit more active pattern. The Southern Appalachians, the Tennessee Valley, interior South for a snowy year, and that's basically because we're going to be on that battleground between that colder air to the north and the increased moisture to the south for the winter season. So the highest likelihood for consistent cold weather, is certainly going to be in the Midwest and the Northeast when it comes to mid to late winter. And I shouldn't say certainly because we know that things can always happen. But when it comes to the mid and late season, that's when we think the coldest weather will start making more intrusions across the Midwest and the Northeast. And then our final bullet point here is the gradient with above and below normal temperatures might be quite sharp, like we're seeing in our maps. Definitely a gradient right across, a lot of, I-70 moving to the east towards I-95 along the East Coast. Might be very sharp there. Couple of swings certainly likely, right, Ken?
Indeed, and I would actually, we wouldn't have the guts to forecast this at this lead time, but I could actually imagine that average slither like decreasing in size as we get closer, and maybe even shifting north. I think so. We'll have to see how that pans out. But yeah, there will likely be swings, and when do you get the swings? Around the stormy periods. So we'll see how that plays out.
Exactly. So that's the main takeaways here for the upcoming season. But we want to talk a little bit more about what goes into this, what drives this pattern. We talked a little bit about El Nino already, and that's going to be our main pattern driver for the upcoming winter. Yes, El Nino is back. La Nina is finally dead. We've seen it for I think 3 years now, Ken.
Yep,
Is that
3 years. It's been a pesky one, no doubt, and that's why we feel that this winter will be different. There's just no way around it.
correct?
That pattern map is different. El Nino is back, and that it will
Yeah.
certainly increase influence.
And that's El Nino, if you haven't heard in the past, is warmer than normal water across the tropical Pacific. So that's very important. It creates a basically downstream effect to affect weather patterns around the globe, actually, but a lot here in the North America, that's for sure. But you can see here by the guidance plumes, all these different ensemble members are predicting that the El Nino will continue, if not get stronger as we head into the fall. Um, there's very few outliers saying that this will not happen. And, I can, like you said before, we were joking going over this presentation, but this one here, this purple one is already wrong. We
Exactly.
know that based on the current.
Yeah, it just has like a
Yeah.
neutral developing in like 6 weeks, which isn't going to happen. So we're
Ex ex
good.
exactly. So we know that these outliers are going to be off for sure. So we're going to go with the consensus, going with the strong El Nino will occur. It's too soon to discount a high-end moderate event, that sort of thing. And we do see that it does kind of, diminish a little bit through the winter season, but that's to be expected because El Ninos always peak, or typically peak, I should say, in the fall months. So I
And
think what,
and that's to say, like, as importantly, once the
Mhm.
El Nino is established, it almost doesn't matter as long as it doesn't break down too quickly. Its influence is there. So as long as
Absolutely,
it's not like we're banking on this for next spring or anything. Once it's there, it's going to take a while to go away.
yeah.
Even its influences will.
Right. Its influence will be there. There's a lag on the influence, so it's certainly something that's going to be affecting our pattern through the rest of winter. That's for sure. So placement on El Nino is the big key here when it comes to the upcoming winter. So most El Ninos that we see are either east-based, west-based, or basin-wide. So when I'm talking about east-based, I'm saying more in the eastern Pacific along the equator, closer to South America. When it's west-based, it starts moving further out towards the international date line, just south of Hawaii here. And basin-wide is what we're showing here, is just a bit more widespread from the east all the way through the central part of the Pacific, tropical Pacific. So this can have different impacts on our weather. So if it's east-based, wintry weather can be a little bit limited in the northeast quarter of the US. However, if the El Nino is west-based, which we're seeing here in this graphic, or basin-wide, it's more supportive of wintry weather and increased blocking across Greenland. That's where we have these high pressure ridges kind of sitting there and blocking storms from moving out too quickly on the east coast. So that gives us a better chance to see more in the way of snowstorms and wintry weather. So what we're going with this season, currently the El Nino is east-based, which you see here. However, we're favoring a shift to the west, and that's already starting to be seen on this loop right here from back in July through the first part of August here, first half of August. You're seeing those abnormally warm waters starting to expand a little bit to the west, and that's even getting more support from the upper atmosphere and things like that. So this is definitely a favorite thing to occur and what we expect to happen. And what does this mean for our impacts across the United States? Well, basically, across the mid-Atlantic, we could see colder, wetter conditions in that area based on what we're seeing here, that's sloshing to the west. So that's what we have to say about El Nino, but it's not only about El Nino, it's about some warm waters elsewhere, right, Ken?
Yeah, that's right. It's the Atlantic Ocean, not as important from a large scale pattern
Hmm.
perspective, but I mean, a lot of the United States is closer to the Atlantic than the Pacific, so we still want to take a look at it. And as you can see in this general overview, a lot of yellows and oranges of warm water showing up. So,
Yeah.
and by the way, if you can see those numbers at home or in the office, those ones and twos and threes. Those are
Hmm.
degrees Celsius. So you can almost double that for Fahrenheit. And to see like this wide of a area, 1, 2, and 3 above normal in waters that are already supposed to be kind of warm anyway, that's kind of
Right.
stark. So
Yeah,
kind of
absolutely. Not to interrupt, Ken, but that's why we're starting to see some of the tropical activity picking up here
absolutely.
recently,
Hmm.
because we have this above normal water temperature, especially across the main development region or the MDR here, where you can see those anomalies of 2 degrees, 3 degrees Celsius. So tropical season picking up. However, I think El Nino will tamp that down.
It will. If there was not an El Nino in place, it would
Yeah,
be like a hyperactive year, no doubt, because the water's just warm, plenty of energy. But
yeah,
more focused towards winter though, because that's what we're really here for. A
absolutely.
couple things we want to point out here. Um, the the first one is the Gulf Stream, area number
Yeah.
one. Obviously, the Gulf Stream is always an area of warm water anyway, but even there, you can see some of those darker oranges and reds. So there's places in there that are 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. So doesn't really do much for us now, but or even in the actual storm process. But if you do get a storm, that's a good way to increase its strength, because as if that area of warm water stays there, which it probably will for at least a little while, if you get a storm there, you get warmer waters with colder air to the west. That's a great way to
Hmm.
increase what we call the baroclinicity of a storm, and basically just how it gets energy from temperature differences. So if you have
Right.
temperature differences, that's a great way to get stronger storms. Again, not going to make a storm for you, but if you have one, it'll certainly help it along.
Yeah, so maybe there's a little bit increased moisture, increased strength with that storm, with that high gradient between those warm waters and the cold air coming across continental US.
And you got that, active subtropical jet stream. So, just
Hmm.
kind of, you know, if you're looking for snow, I think subtropical jet stream, jet,
Yeah.
a good Gulf Stream, and then maybe a little blocking. Those are pretty good ingredients to get you there. So
Yeah, I
we'll
mean,
see,
we don't
we'll
want
see
to
how they
get
come
too
together.
Yeah, and we don't want to get too far ahead. I mean, we're talking a lot about big storm potential, but right along the coast, it can also mean a little bit more warm air gets entrained into the storms, maybe giving
That's
a
the
snow to
fear,
rain
especially early in
situation.
the year. Especially
Right.
early. November, December can be very dicey in that respect. So, yes,
So
correct. But
something we definitely are being careful about when we're looking at these bigger storms for sure.
indeed.
Yeah.
Um,
But another region that we're looking at, Ken, here is just south of Greenland, region two. Again, really warm waters going on there, above normal waters. And typically, this is more supportive of blocking high pressures during the winter season, right?
Exactly, and that's just,
Mhm.
as we talked about a little bit already, that's just how you get the storms that come by to kind of not be progressive and move through real quick. You get these storms to
Right.
kind of take a slower track, maybe even come more up the coast. Uh, Again, support, it's more of an enhancer than a developer, but if it's there, that's how you get the more impressive storms. Or
Right.
even, it doesn't need to be an impressive storm. Sometimes it can just slow down a clipper. You can just have
Hmm.
what would be just a batch of, relatively nuisance snow showers that maybe ends up being a couple of inches versus just a 6 hour intermittent snow shower thing. So even if there isn't a big storm, blocking can at times be helpful from that respect as well.
Yeah, so that's why we're seeing, that's why our forecast is kind of leaning on a little bit more precipitation here. We have a lot of key players in place to potentially lead to a little bit more snow, but it's all going to be the amount of cold air that we get in there, the amount of blocking that we see to slow up those storms and make sure that cold air stays locked in for these coastals that do develop. So a lot of ingredients there. I said to Ken earlier, if you're looking, for snow, at least in my opinion, sometimes I like that little bit of El Nino influence in there because we have that increased moisture, so the potential is higher. But then the trade-off is the cold air. Does it stay? Does it leave? Does it warm? So that's what we're going to be looking at. And I think that blocking is going to be key to how much snow that we're going to see here in the eastern portion of the country.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because that, you can have the best pattern ever, even a very cold, moist pattern. But
Hmm.
if that, sometimes that keeps the storms, suppressed to the south, and you can have a good pattern, but almost quote unquote waste it from a snow standpoint. So it's this delicate balance, and the
Yeah,
balance is it seems to get trickier every year because there's always something else that happens.
yeah, absolutely.
Is it that warm water that you think is good that all of a sudden becomes a negative? Is it is the air a little too cold and you just displace the storm tracks. So
Yeah,
again, there's plenty of time to iron that kind of stuff out, and that's what we'll have in future outlooks as we go
yeah.
forward.
As a kid, I was always um, mad when I had a lot of cold air in place, and then it was just dry.
And that happens. I mean, that happens. Cold and dry
Absolutely. And I was
is
like,
a frequent combination.
yeah, I always said to myself, this is a waste. But anyway, so that's what we're expecting for the pattern. So Ken, where do we go from here as we head through the fall as far as future outlooks?
Sure. Yeah, we're about 3 weeks away from our second outlook by
Hmm.
email to our Storm Alert clients. That will include our debuted first snowfall outlook. We'll also touch on a lot of the things that we've already talked about to see how they are changing. Right now,
Hmm.
we're in that kind of stand back part of the process right now, but give it 5 to 7 days, we'll get right back into the middle of that. And then about a month after that, middle of October, we'll put the big the big preseason outlook out where we kind of go.
Mm.
Yes, we talk about the snowfall, but we go on a more monthly breakdown. We try to highlight a little more of those periods of higher interest from both a snow and dryer standpoint. We'll kind of try to single out whatever we can
Right.
with the confidence is, and hopefully we'll have our analogs being even more strong by that point, and give some really good insights into the year. And then shortly after that, we'll be right back here with you guys again doing another webinar. And we'll have a lot more statistics based upon how the analogs play out. Not to mention, we'll also be 60 days closer to winter, so we can probably even start showing, what how the Arctic's looking and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So we'll actually be able to show stuff. And heck, it's probably gonna be snowing in parts of the U.S. at that point, at least in some mountainous areas. So probably a little bit of that to talk about too.
That's for sure. And you wanted to add this little quote in there, Ken, to end off the webinar. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. This is not the end, and this is my favorite Churchill. I'm a history buff. This is my favorite Churchill quote. This is not
Yeah.
the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And I think that encapsulates this time of year perfectly. So we're through the beginning, and now it's we're getting really close to go time.
Right, absolutely. Well, hey, that's it for our winter preview here. For our first, I should say, winter preview to get those preliminary thoughts for the upcoming season. Remember, we are here for you as always. Visit weatherworksinc.com for everything about our company. Also, all of our social media channels. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, wherever there's a social media channel. We're on there. And if you're looking for past webinars, we have plenty of those on our YouTube channel. So please be sure to visit that. So that is it for this webinar, and we'll see you in about 2 months with one of our last winter outlooks for the season.